Hey everyone, so today we're going to continue talking about the biological perspective of psychology by first going over some of the areas of the brain that specifically deal with behavior. These won't, this notes or set of notes will not have studies so much as providing some context and some knowledge in terms of understanding the different parts of the brain for when they come up throughout the year. So what I want you all to do first is to watch this video from Crash Course, which talks about the areas of the brain. And it also includes a great example of how we've sort of learned more about the parts of the brain. A story of a man named Phineas Gage who lived in the mid 1800s. And Phineas Gage was a railroad worker who was packing dynamite for a explosion that was needed by the railroad company. And while he was packing it with this metal rod, the hole where he was packing the dynamite suddenly exploded. And the rod went through his eye, through the frontal lobe of the brain, which we'll talk about the importance of that in just a minute or two, and out. And what happened was he never lost consciousness. He ended up living for another 11 years after this. But the story of Phineas Gage is important because it really illuminates for us early learnings about the importance of that particular part of our brain. And so please just watch that and try to gain some background information before moving on with the rest of the notes. All right, so in terms of talking about the messaging service throughout our body, we are, of course, talking about the nervous system. And there are two parts of the nervous system. So the first is the central nervous system, including the brain and the spinal cord. These are, of course, the major parts of the nervous system. But then we have the peripheral nervous system. We have connecting nerves from the brain and spinal cord. We have sensory organs like our nose, our ears, and the glands within those that sort of pick up sensory information. We have our muscles, which are connected to nerves from the brain, and then also our glands as well. And of course, we're going to be talking most about the brain today. And this is really, I'm not saying anything new that you probably didn't know, but this is the executive control center of the body. All decisions come from here. It's part of the central nervous system, like I said just a minute ago. But in terms of what we're looking for when studying the brain, there's a field called morphology, and this is the biological study of the form and structure of an organism. As we develop, the brain is small at birth and is shaped by both the biological potential of the genetics of the human being, but also the cultural and familial environments. And by that, we are exposed to certain activities, whether it's at home, whether it's at school, that can really change our human potential and allows our brain to continue growing. So when we're talking about psychology on the whole, we would highlight all three of those. But as the reminder at the bottom says, this is the biological perspective. And so really we're going to be talking about that biological potential, those genetics, the brain and how it allows for different behaviors to come through. So make sure if you are being asked a biological level of analysis question that those things are coming up. All right, in terms of how the brain is organized, it is organized in a hierarchical way so that it functions as an interactive process between what are called the cortical or higher regions. These involve planning and motivation. And then the subcortical or the lower regions. They refine and turn plans into behaviors, right? So, think of the cortical as our higher order thinking questions, or higher order thinking, not questions, but planning. But then the subcortical sort of uses the different parts of the brain to sort of put those plans into action. So with the cortical brain structure, these include higher functions. The cerebral cortex consists of two symmetrical hemispheres, and that is part of the cortical structure. And the surface is made up of folded layers of neurons which allow more surface of the brain to be inside of your skull. And so that's another reason why brain size does not necessarily determine things like intelligence or memory, because those people probably have just more folds which allow for a greater number of neurons, or a equal number of neurons, I should say. So the cortical structure is also divided into 4 lobes: the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, and the occipital. And all of these carry different responsibilities, but they all interact with each other in some way. So general communication between these 4 lobes allow the cerebral cortex to function as a whole. The first of these, and probably the most overall important, is the frontal lobe. As we saw with Phineas Gage in the video, after the pole went through his head, it went through his frontal lobe, and he was no longer able to really control his behaviors. He was no longer able to really be Phineas Gage, or the Phineas Gage they had known before. And this is the part of our brain that differs most from animals. It's responsible for our ability to cognitively control, and the ability to select thinking, deciding memories from a large variety of choices, and then boil it down to the most potentially successful options to direct our behavior towards. However, it takes a long time to mature. It goes through a major growth spurt during adolescence, and the brain constantly grows new neurons and connections to adapt to anything learned, or eliminating unneeded neurons that aren't needed. And so, like, in terms of puberty, your cerebral cortex and your frontal lobe really go through huge amounts of changes during this time. And so while the body and the brain is sort of figuring that out, things like self-control at all times, inhibition, saying the right thing, being responsible, those sorts of things can be affected up until about the age, under some theorists' perspective, 23 or so. We are still growing in these changes. That doesn't mean we won't make mistakes after our 23rd birthday. They're further responsible, or the frontal lobe is responsible for problem solving, judgment, inhibition of behavior, even going further down, personality, motor planning, organization. So this is a hugely important lobe of the brain and part of the brain. The next lobe is the parietal lobe. It is the lobe in charge of skin sensation. So anything that is on your skin, our sense of touch, taste, smell, even on your the skin of your tongue, that is part of the parietal lobe. And it allows us to sort of make differentiation in terms of size, shape, color, spatial perception, visual perception as well, reading and writing, because those are, and math calculations, those are part of that differentiation of size, shape, and color as well. The occipital lobe is in charge of visual perception. It has a visual reception area, so it takes in visual information and interprets that visual information. And then it's also, of course, involved in reading, so perception and recognition of ideas, words, sentences, concepts, that sort of stuff. The last of the 4 lobes is the temporal lobe, and this is for hearing perception and interpretation. If you ever hear anyone say that they got hit in the temps, and they usually point to the area, you know, on their skull, right by the ears, that's because they're pointing to their temporal lobe. or what they think is their temporal lobe. So other functions that are involved in the temporal lobe: understanding language, organization and sequencing, information retrieval, musical awareness, memory, hearing, learning, feelings. All of these things are part of the temporal lobe. And the reason why memory is a part of this is because so much of our memory is guided by audio clues. I'm sure even as you think back on stuff, you can feel like you're hearing the person say it in real time. And so even though it's slightly distorted or it's slightly different, that is a part of our memories. All right, the subcortical brain structure, again, is the quote-unquote lower brain, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't involve many different functions that help us to survive. And so even though these other lobes sort of make sense of our world, allow us and help us for higher order thinking, the subcortical brain structure puts those plans into motion. It sort of makes up the foundation of our brain. And these are the more primitive brain parts. They are shared with other animals. They're located under the cerebral cortex. And so, again, allows and works with different parts of our functioning as living, breathing creatures. All right, so the first of these is the brainstem. So this is the base of the brain where the spinal cord meets the brain. Some of the main survival functions of the body. It's probably the oldest part of our brain, evolutionarily, I should say. So the main functions of this: sense of balance, reflexes to seeing and hearing, autonomic nervous system, breathing, heart control, digestion, heart rate, all of these things, sweating, that are a part of just our functioning as living, breathing creatures. At least I didn't stumble on that one this time. So there are three parts: the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. And both the medulla and the pons, as it says there, regulate breathing, heart rate, organizes reflexes, helps with balance, and then the midbrain controls related to movement and motor skills. So moving on past the brainstem, the thalamus is on top of the brainstem, and it's sort of the relay station for the brain. It's connected. It connects messages to other brain parts. It helps keep the brain alert. So for instance, if you smelled a fire, the thalamus would sort of direct those messages to where to go and to what other brain parts needed to be alerted so that you could get out safely. The next part is the cerebellum. It helps coordinate movement sequences. Part of the cerebellum is this part, the basal ganglia, which manages slow, deliberate movements like trying to thread a needle or trying to, paint something that's very small. Very deliberate, slow movements. And then both manage sensory information, though, as well, because all of our different senses are sending us information which have some part in our ability to have motor skills. Even things like our ears are helping us with balancing. All right, so the limbic system is a lobe, so to speak, of three different parts that form an evolutionarily older part of the brain. So this includes the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. We're going to see the amygdala quite a bit this year in studies. It regulates basic drives like fear and some emotions. It's highly involved in anxiety and depression. So for instance, if you have anxiety, like I do, your amygdala is very overactive in terms of processing all these different fears. Oftentimes you're taking even threats that have not occurred and your amygdala is processing them as if they are a threat to who you are as a person. And so certain studies have shown that the amygdala is less active after taking things like Prozac, as fears become calmed down. It's also involved in what's called flashbulb memories. And flashbulb memories are memories that are very vivid, that you can remember intricate details about them even years after they've occurred. So for instance, a big event in my life was 9/11. And I was in 6th grade at the time, and I can still remember almost everything about that day almost 20 years later. And so the amygdala sort of controlling emotion, which has been strongly indicated to stronger memories of events, has allowed it to sort of take this role in memories as well. The next part is the hippocampus. So this is related to memory and emotion. Stress can affect our memories. As we've talked about before, and we will talk about throughout this year, stress is really a major threat or challenge to our normal functioning as a human being, because it affects so many different parts of our body and our brain. It's really, managing stress is one of the great challenges of anyone's lifetime. The next one is the hypothalamus, and this regulates the internal environment of the body. It controls the release of certain hormones. It releases hormones that control most of the endocrine system throughout our bodies as well. So sending them to those different glands. All right, with that being said, those are just some of the parts of the brain, and they are the major ones that we're going to be looking at this year. It's going to be important that we know these and we know their basic functions so that we can attempt to understand the brain's role in our own behaviors much more. If you have any questions on this, please let me know. And as always, I'm available for email or talking to me in class. All right, have a great day.